Good morning to you all. This is Jean Lowry. I'm the president of CAIDP, and it is my pleasure this morning to welcome all of you to this webinar. It is a series we have been working on for the last few months, and I believe that it helps lay the groundwork for a lot of thinking and planning and strategy for our members and our various partners. CAIDP is a volunteer organization run by volunteers. The board of directors are all volunteers, and we have a mandate to work with our partners, including GAC, to develop processes and procedures that make delivery of aid more efficient. The benefits of membership are innumerable, and I won't read them all out, but I think the primary one for me is the ability to network with your colleagues and peers. So if you're not already a member of CAIDP, I would very much encourage you to become a member and to participate in our conference that we will be holding in Ottawa on October 7th and 8th. Now, it is my opportunity now to introduce our panelists for this session on the Feminist International Assistance Policy. So what has happened after 2 years? And this is our theme for the day, Canada's Progress in Shaping a Feminist Policy for a Better World. Our first speaker will be Gavin Charles, who's the policy team lead for the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. Gavin Charles is the policy team lead at CCIC, Canada's umbrella for civil society organizations working in global development and humanitarian assistance. In this position, he leads analysis and advocacy on the Council's external policy files, including humanitarian assistance, partnerships throughout the international cooperation sector, and an enabling environment for civil society. He has a strong background in international policy and politics, having previously worked as the legislative assistant to Canada's shadow foreign minister, among other roles in government and academia. He holds an MSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, along with education from work and travel in more than 30 countries. Gavin will be our first speaker, and he will be followed by Aniket Bhushan, who is the lead analyst and principal investigator for the Canadian International Development Platform, a data analytics and policy research initiative on Canada's engagement with the developing world. His work sits at the intersection of data, technology, and international development. He is also an adjunct research professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, which is at Carleton University in Ottawa. So with that introduction, I would like to hand over the panel discussion to Gavin. Gavin will then hand it over to Aniket, and I will be back in at the end of this session to handle the question and answer period. So I ask you all to sit back, enjoy, and as you have questions, please type them in and we will pick those up at the end of the session. So thank you all, and Gavin, over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jean, and thanks to CAIDP and to everyone who has joined the conversation this morning. It's great to have you with us. So it's my pleasure to speak a little bit to CCIC's perspective on the Feminist International Assistance Policy in relation to the policy itself, the process of implementation, and the practice, to what extent it has been put into practice in the Canadian context so far. So I'm going to start with a little overview of the FIAP and the registration poll that was done. There seems to be really excellent knowledge among the participants in this conversation in terms of the detail of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. But I'll do a quick overview from CCIC's perspective, then pass over to Aniket and come back with some thoughts on implementation. So in terms of perspective, I think it's useful to look back to the launch of the Feminist International Assistance Policy in 2017 and recognize that it really did represent a significant policy shift, but B, a fairly significant reflection of the input received during the 2016 International Assistance Review, in which I'm sure many of you participated. So, I mean, above all, the Feminist International Assistance Policy embodied a feminist approach with gender as a standalone and cross-cutting theme. There were a number of key and fairly substantive commitments in terms of refocusing bilateral assistance towards gender equality focus, and Aniket will speak more to how that's been put into practice. Beyond those specific measures that are outlined on the slide, 15% of bilateral assistance targeting gender equality specifically, moving up, should note, from a very low mark of 2%, which was consistent internationally. So the 15% ambition is really quite striking. And then 95% supporting gender equality as either a primary or a secondary target. Beyond the kind of principle of a feminist approach in the FIAP, the FIAP also embodied a very strong commitment to human rights-based approaches. And I think that broader context of feminism within a context of human rights is an important element of the FIAP that's important to acknowledge, along with this final point around building local capacity and supporting least developed and low-income countries as a particular focus of Canada's strategy. That came at the same time as Canada ended its countries of focus approach. So there was a transition from a geographic focus, perhaps, to a more thematic orientation. At the same time, there were a number of elements that caused reflection and, to some degree, concern within civil society in terms of what was reflected in the Feminist International Assistance Policy and what was perhaps left out. So while there was a real effort to advance an agenda around gender equality, there was little in terms of the structural and systemic aspects that underpin gender equality implementation. And related to that, there was no clear action plan at the time for what new programming would actually look like and how that would roll out. And so those are kind of key elements to recall in looking forward to implementation. What was missing at the time of the launch in 2017 and what's happened since then. There were a number of significant elements of historic Canadian contribution that were not noteworthy in their presence in the Feminist International Assistance Policy. Relatively few references to children and youth, food security and agriculture, sanitation and hygiene, areas of strong Canadian contribution historically. And again, we were certainly looking to the implementation of the FIAP as an opportunity to bring out some of those elements. Canada has a strong history of contributing on aid and development effectiveness principles. Again, not a significant presence in the FIAP. And perhaps most significantly in terms of the ambition of the Feminist International Assistance Policy was the lack of an accompanying ambitious resource stream to support the implementation of the FIAP. And so when we saw the defense policy being announced the same week as the FIAP with significant resourcing and the FIAP coming out with no additional dollars at that time, there was a noteworthy contrast. And it is worth noting that at the end of this government's mandate, it sits with the lowest record on official development assistance of any Canadian government in half a century. So there is that kind of contrast or tension between a very ambitious and progressive policy agenda and perhaps a shortfall in the resourcing required to accompany that. So implementation came swiftly after the FIAP was announced, at least in terms of consultation and engagement around that process. But it was a lengthy process. There were a series of consultations with civil society around implementation documents for the FIAP action areas, the so-called FIAP policy suite. But it was more than 2 years later that the first action area policy was launched in April of this year, and I'll speak to that a little more later in the webinar. There was a commitment at the political level to launch the rest before this fall's election, and that was done earlier this summer. And those action area policies were accompanied by a suite of internal guidance notes at Global Affairs Canada, around feminist approaches, innovative finance, and innovation for development. So some key areas of change in terms of Global Affairs Canada's approach and ambitions in relation to its international assistance delivery, and those how questions form an important element of FIAP implementation alongside the more thematic what. So with that, I'll end my first portion of the presentation and pass over to Aniket for his portion.
Good morning. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Gavin. Let me just contextualize the slides. There are a number. I believe they will be shared with all participants, so I will go through them fairly quickly, and they are intended as more of a sort of a visual perspective to complement and build on some of what Gavin's already said. Just to put a little bit more context around what you're seeing. So we have a report which will be launched next week, I think towards the middle of next week, titled Canadian Aid and the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals. The report is a joint initiative that we have undertaken, the Canadian National Development Platform, which I lead, along with Engineers Without Borders Canada. And with that, let me dive right into this. Okay, so in contextualizing the work that this report speaks to, really it's a period analysis starting in 2015 and reflecting on performance. So I should say at the outset, assessing performance of a donor on sustainable development goals is not straightforward. There is a official process called the VNRs, the Voluntary National Reviews. Canada submitted one in 2018, but it didn't get at the question that we were interested in, which is at the bottom of your screen in highlight, I hope you can see, which has to do with how well Canadian assistance has been positioned to support efforts to meet the SDGs globally through ODA principally. And that's mainly what I'm going to talk about. The context for this, of course, is that 2015 was a really important turning point in that the SDGs were agreed, but not only that, you also had the COP21 agreement around climate. Let me just move on. What I'm going to talk about here really is three things. I'm going to present our framework of analysis, our main findings, really 2 points, I would say no more than that in each area. I think I'll be light on the last one, more due to time, and we can talk about it further in the Q&A, and focus more on the first 2 parts of our framework. And then I'll hopefully have some time to take a step to looking ahead as what we think should be considered by a new government, even if it's the same government. So our framework is built around first a test. So we developed an index of spending on the Sustainable Development Goals. We wanted to see how donors tend to spend on SDGs, because the SDGs are broad. They are a very vast agenda with 17 goal areas, as most people know, and they're a very expensive agenda. We hear often about the trillions in gap in terms of funding required to meet the SDGs. So they're fairly daunting. What we found when we crossed our index with donor spending, as you can see in this scatter plot on the screen, is a negative slope. We're not suggesting any causation here, but just simply to provide an understanding that larger donors can afford to and do spend more broadly across the various 17 areas of the SDGs, where smaller and more mid-sized donors do focus. So that gave us our first kind of entry point. Given Canada is really a mid-sized donor, how does it position relative to an agenda that is so broad and that calls for so many demands, where you really have a limitation overall in terms of capacity and resources? So our framework is quite simple. It's a threefold framework. It looks at three things: prioritization, resourcing, and influence. The hypothesis is very simple, which is that as a mid-sized donor, Canada is better off setting strong priorities. Secondly, if it has set good and strong priorities and clear priorities, resourcing and backing those priorities effectively. And thirdly, it's critically important to also leverage non-financial influence when you are, in relative terms, constrained in terms of what you bring purely in dollars and cents to the table. So those are the questions we pose, and let me walk you through what we have found in each of these areas. So on prioritization, we've already touched on this somewhat. Gavin's done a good job of laying out some of the processes. I think it's at one point he mentioned there was a swift move. I would say, if anything, it was a very staggered move and slow move. You had a policy review process. And in fact, if you think about even from the point when the policy was launched, at the initial instance of it, there wasn't even an understanding of the need for it to be supplemented by either guidance or even more so performance indicators. And to us, from our vantage point as data people, that's just almost bizarre. I was reading something in the media today about the climate plan that is a lot in discussion now, and it seems like very much the same thing, which is, we will set the broad tone, but we will leave the details to emerge later, and this causes some issues. So on prioritization, we've looked at it three ways. We've looked at it relative to what are the FIAP KPIs, the key performance indicators, which are now out, relative to ODA spending as a share of Canada's spending in the OECD DAC, and also relative to ODA spending per our index. So let me walk you through this very quickly. So what we find is gender is by far the most referenced area in the FIAP KPIs, but also more areas, be it humanitarian, be it health, be it peace and security, be it governance, more areas fit within the SDG 5 complex than any other in the Canadian configuration of the FIAP. So that's sort of important to keep in mind. Furthermore, according to if we apply the spending to our index, what we find is that Canada has actually done a very good job of prioritizing. One might argue that almost too good a job of prioritizing. What I mean by that is when we look and compare to the average in the OECD, we find, I think it's hidden on my screen here, but it's something around 76% as the top 5 SDGs accounting for ODA spending. This is looking at 2017 data. In the case of Canada, we found that 92% of spending can be basically accommodated in those top 5 areas. Those top 5 areas amongst the SDGs for Canada and the OECD DAC more generally tend to be gender, poverty, climate action, inequality, and global health. So really, most of Canadian spending can fit in there. And more importantly, most of Canada's concentration, almost exclusively, is driven by gender. So here's a tree map of what the split looks like for the OECD. You can see it by the SDG areas. And again, this is all going to be available to you both in the paper that's forthcoming as well as in the slides that will be shared. And this is what the picture looks like according to our analysis for Canada. So as you can see, gender is a very big chunk there. According to our math, about 40% in 2017. If you compare amongst the SDG areas, is by far the biggest area where Canada has prioritized. When we look at it relative to DAC shares, we see the same sort of trend. So Canada makes up only about 2.3% of total OECD DAC ODA. But when we look at Canada's share of what's called gender-related health ODA, so that is a combination of 2 key priority areas for Canada, excuse me, we find the ratio at about 6%. So almost 3 times Canada's share of generally DAC ODA goes to gender-related health. So then we set out looking at whether priority areas have been resourced adequately. And first, we found a bit of a contradiction depending on the perspective you choose to take and emphasize. And Gavin's already alluded to this, so I won't belabor it too much, but it is a fact that the current mandate would be on track and is going to have the lowest ratio in terms of development spending relative to gross national income in recent history, and far below even Canada's average, which used to really hug the OECD DAC average. But it's also interesting to look at it in absolute terms, because this is also happening at a time where total international assistance spending is actually at an all-time high in Canadian dollar nominal terms. Moreover, gender-targeted spending is also at an all-time high. And you could also put this in the context of Budget 2018, which, to quote the Minister of Finance, added a historic $2 billion to the international assistance envelope, which is not untrue. It's true, but it is contrasted by the fact that that addition, given when it has come about, as in so late and deep into the mandate and so far into a declining trend, is probably enough, according to our analysis, to stem the decline, but not enough to reverse Canada's position. Much of our analysis goes deeper at the sector level, and this is, I think, where it gets interesting, because what we find is the places which are overweighted and are much in the focus of the FIAP, I mean, they're feminist and gender-oriented, obviously, are really, you see a hockey stick projection off the charts in terms of spending. So we can see that GAC's gender-related aid spending now is at a very significant high, about ranging upwards of 87% of spending. So relative to that 95% target that Gavin mentioned, we're already around 87 odd percent. But moreover, what is this driven by? Well, we can see in the second panel graph that you have that a large part of the driver is spending in SRHR, which we saw increase by 50% in just a 1 year-on-year trend, 2016-17 relative to 2017-18. So these are significant, indications of backing resources and priorities. So we set about asking ourselves the question whether this applies across most priority areas and other priority areas. And this is where we think the story starts to become a little bit more tenuous. So the other one that we look at, which I think and I hope will be of interest to participants here, and certainly is extremely timely, and I didn't time it this way, but is Canada's support for what we call global climate action. So in 2015, climate action development countries right out of the gates was announced as a major priority. I don't know if people will recall, even but one of the most early and significant financial commitments that was made on this file was actually the $2.65 billion 5-year spending commitment that the Prime Minister made in the lead up to COP21 in Malta. This was announced at the time as a doubling of the previous commitment level, and on face value, it actually does seem like it is a doubling, given the previous commitment was about 1.2 billion. But this is not the case, and we've gone to quite a lot of length to try to unpack this, where the time is the key differentiator here. So according to our analysis, the previous commitment was ranging at around 400 million a year, and the current will end at in 2020, averaging out to about 535 million a year. So clearly, climate-related spending has increased, but it's not on track to double, and it won't double. So here are two panels that are showing you some of these trends side by side. Let me walk a little bit through this. On the left-hand side, you see the spending on climate-related development finance. This is principally and largely ODA, and it comprises both grant and non-grant. What you can see is that the trend in the last few years has been an upward trend, but it's not exactly doubling. The other thing that I would like to point more to is that our finding, when we look at the balance of that spending, when you look at whether it is bilateral or multilateral, is that Canada is really an outlier when it comes to climate-related development finance compared to peers. And what I mean by that is, if you see that the bar graph, the stacked bar graph, according to our analysis, which is, I should add, distinct or different from the OECD's methodology to do the same thing, and I have very good reasons for that. I can get into it if anybody wants to know the technical reasons, but just to put a point on it, that it is different from the OECD's approach. And even the OECD approach has a similar finding, but the ratios are different. According to our analysis, the use of multilateral channels to essentially deliver Canadian climate finance or Canada's support for global climate action or climate action in developing countries is overwhelming. So you have about 91, 92% in 2017 that is really all through multilaterals. Now, that's fine where it's an area where there's a lot of specialization required. But if you look at climate donors who are leaders in the space, such as Germany, Japan is the largest climate-related ODA provider. You see that they prioritize bilateral action, more direct action, for various reasons. We have some work coming out on the platform today and tomorrow, in keeping with the climate strikes and everything that's coming up. That shows that there are also policy gaps. And let me get to some of that now. So on resourcing, our summary really is that the areas that have been backed, such as FIAP-related gender spending and SRHR spending, are strong, and the trends in other areas are a little bit more circumspect. So specifically, we point out that the international climate action, which was recognized as an early priority in 2015 and received a 2.65 billion commitment, doesn't actually make Canada amongst the top climate donors. And moreover, it relies very heavily on multilateral channels. And according to our analysis, misses key opportunities to engage on these issues and connect the domestic to the international. The OECD conducted a peer review of Canada, which we looked at very seriously and discussed with the OECD as part of our work, as part of some other work on climate, I should say, but also features in this report. Because one of the seminal points in that, which I think should be of interest to folks here, is that the lack of a private sector engagement strategy in Canada's policy suite, if you will, was again emphasized. And we think that this is a key gap when you look at Canada's approach to climate-related development finance relative to others and relative to leaders. And increasingly, Canada wants to benchmark itself and compare itself to the leaders in the space rather than a middling player. So it's definitely not at that stage, we think, at least in our analysis. So I won't get into influence too much, except to say that the report goes into a lot of length to document and give a summary of just all of the instances of what we would call, opportunities for visibility for the leadership to showcase Canada's work. And there have been several, and they have been really, this has almost been an unusual number, even relative to other mandates and so forth. What I mean by that is you've had everything from right out of the gates, Canada hosting the replenishment, I don't know if people even remember, of the Global Fund, which was, I think, 2016. And, that helped leverage and mobilize $13 billion towards the Global Fund for malaria, TB, and AIDS. But since then, you've had other major opportunities, the G7 presidency obviously being a key one, but also Women Deliver earlier in 2019, the largest global conference on gender equality. So our assessment here on influence is very simple, which is, and this is not very empirical and very data-driven, although there are some data-driven bits in there, such as when you look at the G7 outcome documents, it has more references and more integration of gender than the last 5 G7 outcome documents, for instance. So great, a lot of check marks for a lot of those areas. But our assessment overall is that the overall import here of Canada's influence strategy is very uncertain. And the reason for that is that a lot of time and space and opportunity has been afforded on the global stage. Very high visibility opportunities have been afforded. And for a very image and brand conscious approach, this has been taken up very willingly. So what we think has happened here is that there's actually much more appetite for Canada out there. And the follow-through has been weak and has been not only weak, but probably also waning. So this creates a bit of a gap between perception and reality. I know what I'm saying is probably not earth-shattering, but in certain contexts, such as the level of attention given to forums that have lower visibility, such as in Africa, such as the AU, intergovernmental forums in Africa and others, it's much more circumspect as to Canada's approach there. Furthermore, other avenues, which I've not really gotten into too much here, such as innovative development finance, the IAP, which has been launched only in July this year, the DFI, which has already done a number of deals. Their import in terms of drivers of influence overall is also quite uncertain. So if I have the chance to, I think I do, unless someone flags me immediately, I want to end on what I think are the things we're watching for and our report points to in terms of looking ahead, whether, again, as I said, if it's the same government or a different government or really whatever configuration you get. The first point I'd like to highlight is that there needs to be a focus now shifted to measure in a balanced, hard-nosed, kind of empirical manner the efficacy of FIAP and its prioritization and resourcing. We're a long way from doing that. The FIAP KPIs only came out in early 2019. The policy guidance is also, very recently or more recently being rolled out. Gavin will get more into this, and I'm not all that familiar with that. But all of which to say that, the side of what people are most interested in, as in what this helps achieve and how that's qualitatively different, for us as analysts is becoming harder and harder to prove and show, because the evidence base, the data, the basics just don't exist, at least not in the way that we need them to. So this needs to be, looked at. Secondly, we think that the FIAP needs to build or take some umbrage to build flexibility to circumstances and needs. So much emphasis has gone into the spending levels that when you think about contexts where, such as humanitarian context, emergency dispersals, and so forth, you may require more flexibility, and you may find yourself hamstrung. You may be accused of doing things like "quote unquote" gender washing to meet your targets. In contexts where it's very difficult to do, you may try to do gender because you need to achieve your targets in areas which are much more problematic to do, such as in peace and security, and even in some aspects of climate. Thirdly, we think there is a need to very seriously look at specific gaps. So the lack of a PSE strategy, a lack of a private sector engagement strategy is a specific gap in the Canadian context. Many other donors have some sort of a strategy or a paper or some guiding framework around it. And it also speaks to the lack of a trade and development leverage and complementarity in Canada. Fourth, we think that more effort needs to be paid to widening the domestic constituency of support for development. I completely agree with Gavin about the FIAP responding a lot to the demands of civil society and the engagement with civil society and NGOs and so forth. In fact, I would say that's basically all it's done. So, for instance, there was very limited consultation in terms of taking input from the Canadian private sector or other aspects. And this is really starting to tell and show in terms of the types of constituency that there are in support for development in Canada more generally. And the last two really kind of go together. We think there's a fundamental challenge to ensure that Canada's international assistance spending keeps pace with the stated ambition and, moreover, a growing economy. On one hand, we say Canada's growing faster than any G7 country, and we're doing really well. But at the same time, we're not matching in this area and keeping pace. So what's the solution? We think the way to go, and I'm not advocating for a specific number, whether it's 0.7 or 0.9 or 2.11 or 3.4, we do think that there's some merit to very seriously think about a target or an anchor, whatever the number may be. This has been done before. It has helped depoliticize Canada's spending on development from 2002 to 2010, for instance. Canada had a fiscal anchor for spending. So we think a new government should take that into account. So that's my time, and I thank you very much for your patience and attention.
That's great. Thanks, Jean, and thanks, Aniket. So I'm just going to pick up around the action areas and their implementation or activation, as termed here. So certainly, in terms of the process, as Aniket mentioned, while there was swift consultation in terms of what implementation might look like, that's been a staggered process, and it's been a process that has taken more than 2 years to reach a culmination in terms of action area policies. All of the 6 thematic action areas under the FIAP now have action area policies, and there are 3 specific action area sub-policies under the human dignity area for health, education, and humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian sub-policy was actually the first of the policy suite to be launched in April of this year, and it was launched at the World Bank IMF spring meetings. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time reflecting on that policy in particular, because I do think it's a good example of stakeholder engagement and consultation around policy development, and perhaps a unique example among the action area suite, although there was some consultation, particularly in the early stages around implementing each of these. The example of the humanitarian sub-policy is fairly distinctive in my view. So in terms of the humanitarian policy development process, it started soon after the FIAP was launched in 2017 with a joint submission from civil society organizations working in humanitarian assistance, looking at what would a humanitarian policy look like in the context of the FIAP? And so essentially that means, what would a feminist humanitarian policy look like? And this was a follow-up essentially to a long-standing request from civil society organizations for a more clear definition of Canada's humanitarian policy agenda, which had never been in recent years clearly presented or laid out. So identifying the importance of a comprehensive, an intersectional, an approach that reflects the increasing awareness of the interactions or the nexus between humanitarian response and development cooperation, particularly in a context where much humanitarian assistance and much longer-term development assistance is in fragile and conflict-affected regions. And so there's an overlap and an interplay between humanitarian assistance on the one hand and development cooperation on the other. There was a perception at that time, certainly, that there was an opportunity in the action areas to meet the ambition of the feminist international assistance policy and address some of the concerns that I'd identified earlier in this discussion in terms of the gaps that remained after the overarching policy was developed. And there was a really significant opportunity and opening for discussion of this input with the International Humanitarian Assistance Team at Global Affairs Canada and the Minister's Office at the political level. That was put on pause in some sense through much of 2018, as there was a series of back and forth between the policy and the political realms around what the action area policies could look like. And was picked up again in early 2019, where there was an opportunity for engagement by civil society around the development of a draft humanitarian sub-policy. So the framework of the action area policy suite was clarified, and there was an opening for the Humanitarian Response Network and the Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy Group, both of which are hosted here at CCIC, to engage at both policy and practice levels in the development of that humanitarian sub-policy. So there was a fairly extensive engagement at that stage. And some of the feedback that was given was that there was an opportunity to enhance the strength of the sub-policy by drawing on some of the ambition of the FIAP. So looking back to a rights-based approach, looking back to some of the principles of intersectionality that were implied but not explicit in the FIAP. looking at this notion of the nexus and of how humanitarian and development programming interplays. And the feedback was, again, quite well reflected in the final version. So I think, just as feedback was indeed taken and applied in the context of the overarching policy, that was present certainly in this sub-policy as well, and that was acknowledged in a joint civil society response that was issued following the launch of the sub-policy. I think that's a case study in some sense in good practice in stakeholder engagement and consultation and iterative dialogue, and I think it's a good example to recall as we look to the future with respect to implementation. So in terms of next steps, a few kind of takeaways or key points with which I'll conclude my substantive contributions before we move on. The action area policies are policy documents. Annick had identified correctly that they don't fill the outstanding gap around guidances and specific mechanisms. So they identify some of the key areas, raising the profile of certain activities, certain priorities, certain approaches that Canada will be taking in implementing the FIAP, issues like investments in renewable energy internationally, supporting multilateral and long-term peace building. And so those are elements that weren't fully explored in the original FIAP, but they don't get to the level of mechanisms or specific action plans. So that is yet to come. And there's an opportunity to build on the strong multi-stakeholder engagement that has marked this process right from the International Assistance Review through to the Action Area Policy Suite as we move into implementation. There are some strong commitments here, just as there were in the original FIAP, and those strong commitments will need strong internal guidances and action plans in order to implement. Some of that how is being addressed by the guidance notes that I referenced earlier around innovation for development, innovative finance, gender responsive approaches. But some of that will be specific to the thematic areas that the action area policies address. And so that will be a work in progress. And I think as a closing comment here, continuity and coherence across the suite of policy commitments that have been made and external to the development and humanitarian context as well at Global Affairs will be really important. So ensuring that FIAP implementation is aligned with the other commitments that the government is making in the international space around the humanitarian grand bargain commitments, around the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, and their implementation at the domestic and international level by Canada. Within the civil society partnerships policy, there's some cross-referencing of commitments made in the FIAP as well. And so there's an opportunity for greater integration and continuity across the range of policy areas. That extends beyond, as I say, beyond the development and humanitarian context as well. And I think there are lessons to be taken from FIAP for Canada's broader foreign policy. And with that in mind, I did just want to, flag the Summit on Canada's Global Leadership at the end of November, which is a joint initiative of CCIC, a number of other organizations noted here on the slide, CACID, CanWatch, the Canadian Global Affairs Institute participating. It's an open discussion of some of the key issues facing Canada's international policy agenda. And there will be, for those of you participating in the CAIDP conference next month, there's an opportunity to learn more about the summit at the table there, and a special discount code for CAIDP members available there, which you're welcome to use. So I do want to flag that as an opportunity to continue the conversation around policy coherence and the next steps in terms of Canada's international agenda. And with that, I thank you and look forward to the discussion in the Q&A.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Gavin. And I want to thank Aniket as well for his presentation. I think the purpose behind these webinars is to have this type of dialogue, and we'll be picking it up at the CAIDP conference and then again at the CCIC conference, or the summit, sorry. It's really important that we have this kind of discussion and higher degree of clarity on where we're going, and this kind of facts and figures based presentation is very, very helpful. I did want to ask a question to Gavin from earlier in your presentation. Global Affairs Canada and the government actually claim that they have added significant amounts of funding to the development envelope. And yet both you and Aniket are showing evidence to say that that is not the case. Where is the disparity? Can you respond to that?
Sure. So, I mean, Aniket did a good job of identifying the difference between absolute and relative investments. The $2 billion in budget 2018 was real, and that was a new and additional investment in development cooperation, and certainly CCIC, and I think the sector in general on the civil society side welcomed that additional commitment, and that's been an important contribution from the government. That investment has essentially kept Canada's official development assistance consistent as a proportion of the economy for the duration of that investment. So for the 5 years that $2 billion is spread over, it doesn't represent an increase in the proportionate investment or the relative investment in official development assistance or development cooperation more broadly. And so essentially, as Canada's economy continues to grow, it would be our hope that Canada's investment in peace and prosperity, in the kind of outcomes that development cooperation seeks to achieve, would increase as well, and that hasn't happened. As a result, at the end of that 5-year investment period, Canada's official development assistance will return into decline.
Interesting. Aniket, did you want to
Sure.
add to that?
Yeah, just building on that. I think Gavin is saying exactly what I was trying to say in terms of that difference between a relative approach and an absolute approach. Yes, and there is one thing to look at it in terms of the ratio. I think it's also interesting to go back. I'll make 2 points very quickly. When you look back at the consultation document and discussions around it at the IAR, the International Assistance Review, which led to the FIAP, really the one area that civil society responded and Global Affairs at the time had a very negative reaction to was this idea of having a spending target and 0.7 specifically. So this is again one of these contentious issues. I just think there's a difference of opinion in government completely, where they just don't see much value, I would say. So it's not a surprising question. Secondly, I would say that there's a different way of looking at this, and we've tried to do that in some of our other work, which is to look at it from the perspective of spending needs, right? So in the case of multilateral spending, for example, that's easier to do. That is multilateral assessed contributions. When you look at things like these replenishment cycles for the big vertical funds, I mean, we can just go back to the experience of the Global Fund replenishment, which the Liberal government hosted in Montreal right into their mandate. And basically what their experience from that is, what they found is that even their own assessment of what they thought Canada would be asked to put up, or what Canada would need to put up, had to be increased at the last minute. So my answer to the question about this disjuncture between what we think is happening on spending versus what the government says is happening on spending is to take an approach that future-proofs Canada's international assistance if you're serious about being a significant contributor in this space. You're hamstringing yourself by not having a clear pathway to increments, because the bills are going to be larger in the future.
Interesting. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions coming in from the attendees. The first is there anything we can learn from the introduction of feminist approaches into the development programming of other donor countries? And then the second question, in speaking of opportunities, what opportunities does Canada's push for a UNSC seat present for policy and advocacy work around Canada's international assistance priorities and support levels? So we can take those in either order. So Gavin, why don't you start?
Okay, thanks, Jean. And thanks to those who asked the question. I mean, in terms of the introduction of feminist approaches in development programming internationally, I think and expect that Canada has looked to and learned from the experiences of others, particularly a number of European countries. Sweden comes to mind with a feminist foreign policy more broadly, who have taken a similar step. Of integrating and prioritizing gender equality and feminist approaches. I mean, the Feminist International Assistance Policy as an international assistance policy was a first of its kind. It was new, and so it's a matter of taking lessons from other policy measures to implement feminist approaches, which have touched on the development space. As Aniket says, though, Canada is a significant leader in the implementation of gender equality programming, and new data from the OECD, I know, supports that as well, that the implementation of the FIAP is contributing significantly in that regard. In relation to the UNSC seat, I think it's an interesting question, because certainly historically, international assistance contributions have been a key metric in campaigns for UNSC seats. Canada is campaigning against two countries, Norway and Ireland, that do outperform Canada in terms of relative contributions, with Norway around 1% of GNI and Ireland around 0.31, I think. Interestingly, both of those countries are governed by centre-right parties, which I think is worth bearing in mind. The UK, of course, is a global leader in terms of quantitative investments in ODA, also brought in under a conservative government. So I think there's some interesting examples of how the expectations around ODA and the return on investment is not a partisan question. It's certainly a political question, though, and it's one that does have implications for Canada's UNSC campaign. Aniket?
That's great. Yeah, please, Aniket.
Yeah, sure. On the question of learning from others, I mean, yes, it's already been mentioned. The FIAP itself may be, too new or too much of a first off to compare. But we know that other countries, Sweden again, do purport to having a feminist foreign policy. I think one thing to think about, and I would say especially in the experience of this current mandate, and obviously it's this mandate that's been associated with feminist and feminism more generally, is coherence. And what I mean by that is when you look at the difference between Canada's approach and others. I was on a panel earlier this week, and it was mentioned that if you take feminism in one area and you can't be feminist on something and not on other things which equally kind of mandate or require you to take other positions. And the example the person gave was military contracts, which of course many other donor countries, Sweden included, and other major donors with counterparts who are deemed as being unfriendly to feminism and so forth, have cancelled. But Canada, of course, is an exception. So in a sense, you can say, it's kind of incoherent. So this is just like a normal, a very routine critique here that, this is not a very coherent approach overall. Secondly, on the UNSC, yes, very much so. The competitors there, Norway and Ireland, are better positioned in terms of how much they spend and what they spend in these areas. But I would also say that one of the early, drivers of the 2.65 billion commitment on climate and the way it's structured and spread, because it does, it is spread to intermediate and reach a lot of African countries and partners, not just because of the climate problem. I would also say because they vote on the UNSC. It has been seen as being, as strategic. Now the question is what the outcome will yield on that. I think the strategy is long gone in terms of the space for using the UNSC, the campaign. I don't know, but from any research, but just on hearsay, that the campaign has not seemingly been very strong. In our paper, we look at several other initiatives, such as under the auspices of Canada's representative to the UN, Canada also spearheaded what's called the Friends of SDG Financing Initiative, which again, a lot of impetus, a lot of momentum, but the actual follow through and flow through from that is a different story.
Thank you so very much. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to wrap this up. I'm sorry that we can't take any more of your questions, but I think it has been an extremely interesting and fruitful discussion, and I would like to encourage you all to attend the CAIDP conference, where we're exploring disruption, both the positives and the negatives in the field that we're in the international development sector. That's October 7th and 8th. And for those of you who are not already members of CAIDP, please do consider joining us. We're a volunteer organization, and our membership is how we survive and how we judge what we're going to be doing. So if you'd like to see more of these kind of activities and these webinars, please do join the organization. I'd also encourage you to attend the CCIC Summit. Between CCIC and CAIDP, we cover the entire community, the development community here in Canada. So it's important that you hear all the various opinions and perceptions that were brought to the table. And on that note, I wish to thank Aniket and Gavin. Your presentations were extremely valuable, and they will be posted or shared with the attendees. So if there's any further questions, please follow up. Thank you so much. And Aniket, Gavin, thanks again. And to all of you, have a great afternoon.